the IONS podcast. I'm your host, Cam Dales, co-founder of Peak Energy. I'm here today, actually with a very special guest, who is my co-founder at Peak Energy. And despite the fact that the pod was not originally designed to talk really much at all about what we're doing here at Peak, I hope you'll forgive us this slight indulgence as we bring my co-founder Landon Mossburg onto the pod. The goal of the conversation today is really to get into some of the details around Northvolt. Many of you may have heard about Northvolt in the news. At one point was the largest battery manufacturer in Europe, raised a lot of capital, built several factories, or at least partially, and for a long time there was viewed as really the national champion of the European battery space, which of course the underpinnings of one of the crucial technologies in Europe, which is the automotive sector. Those of you following along, and anybody in the battery industry certainly has probably seen Northvolt in the news, and it's gone through some pretty significant troubles, declared bankruptcy maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, which of course has brought a huge amount of interest, both in the mainstream media, but also podcasts and other things about what went wrong at Northvolt. And at least to my knowledge, I don't think I've seen a single story from somebody who actually was at Northvolt and who lived that experience and has real insight into what really happened. And so with that in mind, wanted to invite my co-founder, Landon Mossburg, who definitely lived that experience for a significant part of his life, to come tell his perspective of the story of what went right at Northvolt, what went wrong at Northvolt, and what can we as an industry learn from it. So without further ado, Landon, welcome to the pod.
Thanks, man. I'm not sure I'm a special guest. Maybe I'm a less special guest. You said very special. I think I'm less special.
I don't know. I think you're a pretty special guy. Would love to hear a little bit about your background, actually, before we kind of dig into the depths of, of your story at Northvolt. I think probably might hold the record for most nights slept on the factory floor by an American in a European factory.
American, yeah, definitely at Northvolt. I don't know about others. Tesla probably give me a run for my money at Giga Berlin, but So I guess I'll start way back when I grew up, born in the U.S., grew up moving around a ton, but only in the U.S. And it wasn't until high school that I traveled outside the country and sort of fell in love with that, decided that when I went to work, I wanted to work outside of the U.S. at least for a little while. So I went to school for business and double majored in Chinese because I was really interested in what was happening in China at the time. This was back in the early aughts. And graduated, took a job in management consulting in Singapore with Accenture because it felt like that was going to give me the widest exposure to geographically, but also to many different companies and industries and things like that. I didn't really know what I wanted to do at the time.
And what was China like when you made your first trip to China?
I was still in college. I think that was back in 2006 or 2007. It was a formative experience for me. The first time I went, I spent about 2 or 3 months there, just traveling around and saw many different places. It was just what struck me, I think, immediately was how fast everything was moving in terms of things changing, and there's just this energy there that was really this dynamism that there were pockets of it that I'd experienced before in the U.S., but it was just everywhere in China. I think what was different there then than now is that there's just this feeling of optimism, both for China itself, but also for the relationship between China and the U.S. It was very much like the U.S. and China are great partners and friends, and we're growing together. And there's a lot. I remember hearing this explicitly from many people, like that we can learn a lot from the U.S. I heard that so many times over there.
Interesting.
And there was like this curiosity and desire to engage and to learn.
Yeah.
And then you sort of juxtapose that. And then I've been spending tons of time in China over the past 15, 17 years of my career so far. And I think what I've noticed has changed is not the speed. The speed is there. It's even like, and it's such an incredibly, if you've never been there, it's incredible because there's there's so much scale. Like everyone knows China's big, but you just feel it there. Everything is bigger, but it's also moving really fast. So the like the sheer momentum of that place is just incredible. It's latent in the air. But I think one thing that's changed between the first days that I went there and now is like justifiably the country and the people are much more confident about what they're good at because they are better than anyone in the world at things like manufacturing and batteries. I mean, there's tons of places where they're just so dominant, it's hard to even understand the gap. But there's also definite skepticism. And like, whereas before when we were going, it was much more about like a partnership mentality towards the West. Now it's much more of a skepticism, competitive dynamic. And of course that exists on this side, but I think it started there a little bit earlier than here. And it's a little bit more of a reflection.
Well, we can definitely talk about that later.
Yeah.
And so you started started your career in China, wanted to work in China, had a bunch of experiences there.
Yeah, worked all around, worked for a bunch of different companies, and I grew up writing software and loved that. I realized very early in my career that I wanted to get back to making things, but I'd gone to school for business. So the closest sort of projects I could get into at the time were in the M2M IoT space, and became kind of a subject matter expert within the firm on that. And through those sort of relationships, met a guy named Peter Carlson, who at the time was the chief procurement officer at Tesla. And he was looking for somebody to help lead out the global connected car strategy for Tesla, which was a commercial role. But I was fascinated with Tesla and SpaceX and sort of the things Elon was doing at the time, and wanted to go be part of that, and left. It seemed like a good move. Moved my family to California, and I was at Tesla for about 4 years. And Tesla back then, I'm not sure how it is now, but it was sort of a special place where you have your remit and work that you're supposed to work on, but there was just so much stuff going on. And if you could contribute in an area, no one really cared what your job description was. So nights and weekends, I started doing some software stuff just to help first with my scope, but then started helping out in other areas. Fast forward 4 years, I was only running engineering teams. I'd sort of gotten rid of all my commercial responsibilities, and we're working in the factories and doing a lot of like computer vision stuff, and just fell in love with automation. And around that time, Peter had left a couple of years before that to go invest in companies, and eventually he started Northvolt. And I had been talking to him for a little while about that. Him and Paolo Soretti's co-founder there, who was also at Tesla, where I worked for a little while. Amazing people, both of them. And they approached me and asked me to come out, move to Sweden, help them start the company. And I was loving what I was doing at Tesla. Turned them down to a few times, but eventually it just seemed like the team they'd built, like what they were working on, was so big and interesting. I couldn't pass up the opportunity. So,
and what was the vision of Northvolt?
I think Peter and Paolo and Carl Eric, who is the third co-founder there, they sort of all came at this with different angles, but they saw a gap that batteries, EVs were going to drive a huge demand for batteries. Batteries were predominantly being produced out of, at the time, actually, it was like Japan and Korea were like the leaders. China was into it, but it was more for domestic market. CATL was starting to come up at that point, but it was still early days. But there was already a trend to shift these the production, if not the ownership of these things, to China. And I think one thing Peter realized was that the dynamic for the EV transition in Europe especially was driven by sustainability. But the supply chain for batteries was pretty dirty. Even at that point, it was getting dirtier. And so those two themes didn't really mesh. And he saw an opportunity. Well, let's there's domestic manufacturing play here, but it's actually more about sustainability.
Interesting. I remember seeing the announcements of Northvolt. I was at Innovix at the time. And the thing that was amazing to me was how this company managed to raise so much money and have a vision of building out this whole ecosystem within Europe without any real technology differentiation, at least from the outside. Yeah. I know that's not quite true.
Yeah.
But, with a Silicon Valley hat on, we're all thinking, these guys have no technology.
Yeah.
Like, how do you build a company that is not based on a core of technology differentiation? And the thing that I think I didn't realize at the time was the differentiation in the battery space actually is being at scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the rare commodity is the manufacturing scale and the ability to do that, the know-how to do that, the financing to do that, as opposed to some incredible technology, differentiation or invention that you ultimately protect through, IP, et cetera. And sure seems like there's a lot of IP around in the battery space. Every professor in the world of chemistry has a great idea for the next new battery. But how many of those actually make it to market?
Yeah, and I think that like the patents and IPs in the space, it's much less about like that's the thing that's going to make you successful. It's more viewed as like you need to figure out freedom to operate. Like you need to de-risk the fact that somebody's not going to come sue you later on. But if you have a great patent, that's not enough to make a great business.
Right. And so if you think about kind of what was Northvolt's scope when you started there, which was pretty early, almost arguably part of the founding team, and what it ended up being, and how did that process happen? Because I think, not to bury the lead here, but one of the criticisms of Northvolt is that the scope was so large that no single company could possibly start up from scratch and then ultimately cover it all.
Well, it's interesting you say, because like one of the reasons I was skeptical about joining in the beginning was I thought that the reason I didn't, I knew Peter and Paul. They're very impressive people. Also, doing what we did at Tesla was so hard that you kind of came out of that thinking you could accomplish anything. So I heavily discounted the execution risk. Like I was like, okay.
Which, by the way, I want to get back to that point because I think you've touched on it a couple times now. The secret sauce of people who had that early Tesla experience. I want to get back to that point, so remind me later.
Yeah, I'll try. But so we did, like as I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, the reason this might not happen is not because it's hard to do. It's because nobody is going to go give them enough money to go do it on a PowerPoint deck, which is functionally kind of what we had in the beginning at Northvolt. But I was wrong about that, actually. One of the things that they were the best at doing was like getting stakeholders in the boat.
And how much money did they end up raising so far?
I mean, I don't know what the final count. Definitely over $5 billion. I think approaching 10, if not more than that.
Right.
A lot of that happened after I left.
And a lot of those investors were strategic investors, right?
So the financing strategy is pretty interesting. We I think in the very, very early days, Northvolt did shop around for more VC type money, but like nobody wanted to do that, right? So like the VCs were looking for, like you said, they were looking for some sort of tech. And just to address that point, actually, Northvolt did part of the story, and definitely some of the stuff they had was some technology innovation in the process, and also some recycling IP. So they had some interesting hydromat recycling IP. Emma, who ran that side of the business, fantastic, amazing person, did a lot of research there and brought in some great people who had great ideas. So on the recycling side, I think a lot of really interesting things there. And then we also looked at the full process, and there were some areas that we were taking big bets on to try to like improve. So one of them was getting much more continuous about the cathode manufacturing process using rotary kilns instead of rolling hearth kilns. Can get kind of tight, but interestingly, not accepting the recycling stuff, I'm not really sure where that happened because a lot of that fell out, like sort of matured after I left. But on the more continuous manufacturing parts and cathode manufacturing, slurry mixing, these things that we were thinking about changing, they work in the lab. They even work at like pilot scale. But even as you start to scale them up bigger than that, you run into process problems. It's like just super hard to figure out. And so, like to your point, like these new technology bets that we like sort of were making as part of the story, and we really believed in. Obviously, we did because we were investing in tons of time and money into them. They were the first things that were wrong, but they didn't kill us. I mean, even though like because we were at such scale, we managed to weather those failures, even though we put a lot of money into them. They didn't pay off.
Almost like A123 back in the day, right? I mean, A123 had very innovative manufacturing technology that they built the company on, but then ultimately scaled it and grew it through fairly
mundane
fairly
stuff, things
quote
that
unquote
already happened,
known technologies. Yet the real challenge in all of that was scaling and manufacturing and quality ultimately.
And I don't really know because it's hard to prove it counterfactual here, but like At Northvolt, if we hadn't had that technical differentiation where we're going to say we're going to be better in these ways, I'm not sure we would have attracted the financing.
Right.
Right. But really, the smart money should have been like, no, guys, like, great, you have these ideas. Do them next.
Let's do a scale up. Yeah.
Do the first thing. Because if you fast forward to today, if we had done that and like a few other things, which we can go into, and I mean, think about the positioning for that. I mean, I lose sleep about this still because, there's such a hole in the market right now for a European or a North American cell manufacturer at scale, and it just doesn't exist today. And if they were there, I mean, the value, right? So it's like
stay tuned.
Yeah, exactly. So we're working on that in other ways, but
So the total scope of what
so it started recycling.
Tried to do end to end.
Yeah. So when I joined, it was like recycling. It was going to be fully vertically integrated all the way to the end of the cell line, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, because we'd all come from Tesla, and I think Tesla's strategy early on with batteries was really, really smart. They realized that like doing a custom cell, even though on paper was the best possible way to do it, scaling that up, dealing with all the problems with trying to qualify that cell and build it into a pack and really understand it well was going to be too expensive, too risky. So Tesla decided to go with like basically laptop batteries in the early days. Yep. And that's 18650s, eventually 2170s, so small format cylindrical. That was by far the right strategy. I still contend that anybody who was just getting it, look at what Rivian's mostly doing that, right? They're probably next to Tesla outside of China. They're really like the only successful ones. But the big established car companies always feel like, oh, I'm going to change this. I'm going to like make a custom cell for me because on paper it looks the best. But walk before you can run. I think that's one of the big things that I learned. And also for our customers, car companies, like now they've mostly tried to run and they're starting to learn how to run, but like it's been rocky for them in a lot of places. And if you start with a commoditized cells, it's easier. But anyway, so at Northvolt in the beginning, our strategy was recycling to cells, and we were going to do cylindrical cells, like 18650s.
Interesting.
We thought at least 50% of our volume would come from that. Ultimately ended up being pretty much zero because nobody wanted to buy those. They wanted all their own custom cells. They wanted prismatic. But in the early days, that's what we thought. And then eventually one of our first sort of strategic investors and customers that came into the company was a company called Epiroc, and they make underground mining equipment. Turns out that if you look at the cost of running an underground mine, one of the huge cost drivers is ventilating all the diesel exhaust from trucks. And so there's an economic case that's extremely attractive for electrifying underground mines.
Interesting.
So we worked with them on an early project. They were such a phenomenal partner and stakeholder for the company, and, taking a risk on us and helping. But part of that deal was that we had to help them. They didn't know how to make a pack, so we had to start making packs. So that's how Northvolt Battery Systems was joined. So now like we're recycling to system.
So recycling of materials, raw materials.
Cathode production. We made precursor. So you go recycling, precursor, cathode, and then you're doing cells. We didn't make anode, thankfully. That was not part of the plan. We didn't make electrolyte or separator, but like we were making cathode. And then we added battery systems.
And then cells, and then systems.
That's right. And prismatic and cylindrical.
And multiple cell factories across the continent.
Well, in the beginning, it was just going to be Northvolt Labs, which was our R&D center and the first line, first sort of pilot scale line. Though it was a very large pilot line. That thing, if you really, at least on paper, if you ran it full out, was several hundred megawatt hours per year. And then the what we originally had scoped at 32 gigawatt hour of capacity up in northern Sweden and Skellefteå, which eventually we expanded the plan.
So one of the criticisms of, kind of the company is that the vision was huge and the scope was too much. What does that actually mean, though, in practical, in practical ways around sort of the engineering and the manufacturing? Like, how did that manifest as being a bridge too far?
I mean, I think it was the right plan because like eventually you want to have all those pieces somehow, whether you do them all in one company or you do them as part of a consortia of partners. You could debate which is a better strategy. There's upsides and downsides with both. I think the ambition was probably a little too high and that we should do them all in parallel. But I think learning from these is really important for the industry. I don't think that by itself, none of these factors we'll talk about by themselves are enough to tank, right? And then there's a broader macroeconomic context here that I think is really important for us to talk about it too, with in terms of setting the competitive dynamic from China and all this stuff. We can get into that, but I think in general, like the vision was the right vision. Doing it all at the same time made us raise too much money too quickly, get too many people in the company too quickly, or quicker than we would have been easier. That would have been less problem for us to deal with later on, right?
So there's this company scaling factor, but one of the things that we ran into too at Enovix, and I think this is underappreciated in the manufacturing of batteries in general, is how interconnected the whole process is, and how important it is to have stability in an upstream process while you're bringing up the next piece of what is essentially a fully automated set of processes and equipment. And if you're just trying to get stability in terms of yield and process up front, you have zero chance of getting the next piece of the line.
Right. Or you have dependencies, right? Like you have counter-dependent. So I think that was definitely – there are some places where it's hard to break. Like at Peak, one of the things we're trying to do is when we go into cell manufacturing, we want to at least have a long-term source of electrode that we can purchase. If we ever make electrode or we don't, that's a different question. But having, like you said, having a stable source of electrode material to go into your downstream processes helps you just rule out one factor of what could be causing you problems later on, because it's not always super easy to understand where the problem is. It usually isn't, right? In Northvolt's case, this vertical integration that problem wasn't the thing that really hurt. It was the fact that because cathode was super delayed, so we ended up having to go source cathode for much longer than we planned, right? So we just did that. It probably hurt the economics. It actually did really hurt the economics substantially for the business case, but it wasn't like we were having like downstream quality issues because we cut our cathode too early. We just never could. But it was more that, like, I think the big issue with the parallelization, and there's some concrete examples. One of them was like when we were bringing up our pilot line at Northvolt Labs, I was sleeping on the floor. So was Paolo, our COO. Like most of our senior engineering leaders were there. We're just focused 100% on trying to get that line up because we had to sample to our automotive customers who were not willing to really change schedules, and because they have big downstream commitments. These automotive programs are massive, and so everybody's attention was focused on that, but we should have been focusing really, really heavily on detailed design for the big factory that was coming online up in Skellefteå, the first lines there. And so by the time that thing stabilized, it was already time for us to all immediately go and start commissioning in Skellefteå. And, there were people working on that, but we had zero time for learning. Actually, it was anti-learning because when we should have been learning, we were still trying to get that line going. So we weren't really learning anything useful other than that this is really painful. And, I wish we had time to like internalize why this is painful and change it for the next thing. But like, even fundamental design stuff that we probably could have done much better if we had had more management bandwidth and more engineering bandwidth focused on what was going to happen in the bigger line, the much bigger investment. You had to stay on that schedule because our customers couldn't change it. And we didn't want to change it either because we had these commitments, and we'd already at that point committed to new factories and all of that stuff. So once you're on that treadmill, you got to start going, right? And
so would you guys have been better off, and this is easier said than done, maybe even impossible under the business circumstances, but just slipping everything when the front end slipped?
100%.
As opposed to just, the front end's, not the front end, but the beginning part of the project, the pilot factory slipped. And everything else stayed the same because you couldn't move the endpoint.
We should have. But I think it's similar to...
Is that even possible?
I mean, I think it's similar to like that question of should we have cut in new technology? Would have anyone invested in us if we... Right? Like if we had slipped those schedules, would Northvolt have failed earlier? I mean, there's a lot of like armchair, I don't know what, hindsight's 20/20 or whatever. But I mean, another thing that at the pilot line, we committed, that original strategy, I keep going back to it, was like, let's just pump out 18650s and sell them to all these car companies who need to learn how to do EVs and make packs for the first time. If we had done that, like every other thing, I think Northvolt would be doing great right now. But we couldn't get the customers to do that. They all wanted their custom cells.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so because of that, we had this one pilot line that had to produce, I think it was 6 different variants of cell.
And it's a big pilot line. I mean, you call it a pilot line, but
Yeah,
it's
it was like
250
megawatt hour. You probably pump it up to 400 or 500, depending on the cell format that we're making.
But not inconsequential.
No, they were real. I mean, it was designed to be process representative for what was going up north. So, where we had tens of stackers per line. Up in Skellefteå, we had one.
So you mentioned cell design, and I know I've heard you tell this story before. But I find it really interesting. If you think back to that time in the world, cell design, at least from a manufacturing perspective, was not really known in the Western world, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how did Northvolt pull together the team to go design these cells?
Yeah.
And then what did that lead to with respect to the manufacturing capability?
Yeah. Well, I mean, originally we started out focused on cylindrical, and the best, I'd say, maybe still, I'm not sure, but certainly the last time I really looked at cylindrical very hard, the best people in the world at this were the Japanese. They invented cylindrical cell. I mean, just incredible technology there. Some of the equipment suppliers still, it's just art what they do. But there's not much expertise in Japan for prismatic, or at least there wasn't at the time, and that's what our customers wanted. So we started looking around, and at that point, Korea had some good folks, or at least looked that way. So we started recruiting folks primarily from Korea with experience in that area.
But you couldn't hire experienced cell engineers in northern Sweden?
There was nobody. I mean, not nobody. I mean, we got some people from Saft and places like that, right? But it's a different type of stuff that Saft makes batteries, but they make very high margin products, right? And so it's a different thing. Even though some phenomenal people, especially on the process side. I'm sure maybe other places too, but the ones I worked with were there. So there are some, but it's like order of magnitude different. And that's one advantage I think the West has today, thanks to companies like Northvolt, whether they succeeded or not. There are a lot more people outside of Asia that have seen batteries at scale and have some experience with it than there were when we were doing it.
This gives us some optimism around starting a battery company now.
Yeah,
we think that the time is right because there's enough talent, technology, and capability in the Western world to make it successful.
Yeah, and you still need to learn, right? Which is one of the reasons that we're, in our strategy at Peak is to try to work with people who know how to do this with existing cell companies. But
so in the products that were designed by the teams heavily influenced.
So we brought in
from Korea.
Phenomenally great cell engineers who had a lot of, and they designed a cell that was incredibly beautiful. Like great cell specs were out of this world. Customers loved it. On paper, it looked like we were going to kill it, right? And we were winning business against CATL and others, even at higher prices, because the customers, one, loved the story of sustainability, but two, they really liked the tech. Unfortunately, then we go to build the factory, and the business case has X. It's based on benchmarks, right? So as we go talk to bankers, they see, Koreans, but increasingly Chinese producers of these of cells, and the benchmarks there show certain level of capex, certain level of staffing costs, and timelines, right? And so it turns out, like to start to compete in these areas, you have to work with those suppliers too, like the equipment suppliers you need to buy from. It wasn't even close. If we talked
in order to be competitive,
a Chinese supplier would commit to deliver to you maybe 50% faster than a Korean supplier at 30% less cost, and you compare that to Europe, and it's like 3x more expensive and 5x slower, right? Like it's not even. You can't. We wanted to, Like we really tried, but it would have fallen apart. Nobody would have invested in it.
Yeah.
Right. So we ended up buying equipment, especially primarily in the downstream parts of the factory from China, and they delivered quickly, slightly slower than they promised, but still pretty quickly, much quicker than we would have gotten it from others, and at the cost that they committed to. But that equipment was not really like I don't know if there was equipment that could produce that cell. Probably is, right? But the equipment, at least at the time, those equipment suppliers were not trying to eke the last few tiny percentage points of energy density out of the cell. I think that there's a much better, at least at the time, probably still today, a much better appreciation for DFM in this space, design for manufacturability, coming out of some of the Chinese players. Maybe than in other places. They're just so phenomenally good at manufacturing, right? And they really appreciate it.
Why do you think that is? It feels like in the Western world we have this fetish with energy density, particularly in the automotive space, other spaces as well.
Yep.
Yet the winners seem not to be the highest energy density, really, as you look back. If you think about why did the West not really bet on LFP?
Yeah.
What do you think it is about that?
I mean, I think it's, there's a story that I think we tell ourselves in the West with respect to competition with China that is not true, by the way. But this is the story that we are great at innovation. They are great at making stuff, like taking our innovation and scaling it up.
Cheap.
Yeah. And doing it cheaply, right? You go to China and you walk into a restaurant there, everything is automated. Like there's robots and the cars are insane. Like they're great at innovation, right? So we should not kid ourselves. They're really good at it. We need to compete on both areas because they are competing on both areas. But I think that's part of it, right? Like how far can we push the energy density up? And there's also this understanding that once you get into more mature platform level decisions that maybe increasing the energy density at the cell level is not the right thing to do. Maybe you need to try to take it out of the pack, right? Because your overall economics and performance is going to be way better if you do that. There's way more margin there. And then eventually you can come back to the cell, and that's what's happening there, right?
When did you personally come to the realization that perhaps Northvolt had bet on the wrong cell chemistry? And I'm talking about you're primarily making NMC, high energy density cells, like basically everybody in the Western world.
Yeah.
Like let's not.
Yeah. Well, let me correct that for a second.
Problem.
I think Northvolt bet on the right chemistry as part of a portfolio play.
Yeah.
But I think not having an LFP option was going to become a huge strategic hurdle for Northvolt to jump over. Probably not even if let's say Northvolt had executed and was doing great.
Yeah.
I think the big problem they'd be fighting right now is like, what are we going to do about LFP? Because it's starting to eat our lunch.
Right.
It's eating everybody's lunch. To be clear, I think in high nickel, high energy density chemistries are going to continue to play a role, but that role is getting eaten from the bottom up. And LFP cells are easier to make, right? Like there's just a lot, like the safety case is easier, cyclability. You're just dealing with a lot of things that are easier, and your scrap cost is lower because raw materials are much cheaper. So I think, but going back to your original point, like we had this cell design that was beautiful, really pushed the limits on energy density and a lot of other performance metrics, but the equipment wasn't designed with that type of push in mind. And so,
Did you just buy off the shelf equipment? Basically?
Oh, no. It was like super, like, and you can't really for this stuff. You design it for the cell, but like it's based on a platform that they build up. Like, they've made prismatic cells, tons of prismatic cells in China, right? By that point, even then. I think, I think if you talk to an equipment vendor, they'll tell you for a given cell that they've made before, they know how to do it. And I believe them. Like if it's a cell they've made before, they know, maybe there's some stuff they don't know exactly. If you ask them, for instance, like, why does this process happen? What happens if I don't do it? For some of those processes, like stacking, obviously you're not going to, nothing works, right? But if you talk about like vacuum drying and you're like, well, you're in a dry room anyway. Why do we need to vacuum dry? Like, should there but sometimes even the cell engineers can't tell you exactly, right? Like, because it's so funny when you look at trying to innovate on these processes too. We did this at Northvolt. Like we're constantly questioning why is this there? Because like from a early, like I'm sure other companies like this, but my experience at Tesla, one of the great things about that was like the sort of this design thinking about best part is no part, best process is no process. How do you simplify? How do you take stuff out? And so we applied that to batteries, right? And so one of the first things we looked at was like vacuum drying. We call it surface treatment, but this doesn't make any sense. Why should we have this here? And I was like one of the biggest critics of this. And now, after being through battery manufacturing, like my inclination is until I get the first factory up and running, there could be like just random, I'm not going to change the color of the machine. I don't want to touch anything until we understand that there's a stable thing, and then you can start perturbing that process. And you can do it very quickly. I think that's a different thing about the way we want to try to do this at Peak now. It's not that we don't have ambition to move really fast and change and improve. It's that we want to get a baseline very, very fast.
Stable.
Like get there as fast as we possibly can, and then iterate and like sequentially improve it. But do that faster than anybody else, right? So it's like GPU versus CPU. We're gonna be much more single threaded, but we're gonna run that thread really, really quickly. And then once we get a little more bandwidth, we'll start adding threads, and we'll get a little more parallelization. But I think and that's one of the, we talked about it already, but I think at Northvolt, one of the things that we were overly ambitious, we were a little bit overly confident about changing too much stuff at the beginning. But that by itself was not enough. You have to combine that with the fact that our suppliers, our equipment was probably, and the manufacturers of that equipment were not used to producing a cell that was so high spec. I think we had not had enough DFN cycles on that cell. And then we worked with customers, automotive companies, who understandably have these huge programs that have so much momentum behind them, and then changing stuff like reducing energy density or something like that, even by small amounts, would have major impacts for them. So they were highly resistant to these types of changes too. So DFM changes were not trivial for us to cut in. And so there's like sort of combine all that stuff. And you layer that on top of the dynamic that's happening in China. And like, this is not, there's no like magic here about what China has been able to do. I think they faced a lot, if not all, of these same problems in the early days. A key difference, though, for a lot of what happened in China, one is like China speed. Culturally, you have to acknowledge the fact that, like, especially in Sweden, from day one, those factories were unionized. I don't think they were, like, the unions we dealt with were not, outrageous, or it wasn't like a nightmare working with them, but they were resistant to things like, asking people to work more than the agreed upon shifts. We had to go negotiate that. Like, if we got behind, we needed to change the dynamic and they wanted you to come back, which is the way you work with organized labor in Europe. And there's reasons for that. But they don't do that at all in China. Right. And then you layer that on top of some other structural problems on the execution side. Building a building. I mean, to me, this is the craziest thing. One of the places where we were more over budget and behind schedule and things were more problematic than anywhere else was the building, the shell, the foundation, like just stuff that's super easy, right? You look at the inside of a dry room in a battery factory, some of these machines, like it's like a magic eye puzzle. They look so complex, right? And to think that like the thing you're most over budget on is like the walls on the outer structure of the building. How stupid is that? Yeah,
this is such an interesting point, because I think we've seen this multiple places in the, certainly in the U.S. also, right? Where construction costs are less predictable than they should be.
Yeah.
And
way too much.
Many companies have grand visions of, we must be at full scale, whatever that happens to be at the time, whether it's 10 or 20 or 30 gigawatt hours these days.
Yep.
There are no buildings that are that size. And therefore we have to go greenfield, do all the site preparation, build the building, and then we can put the battery equipment in and try to get through, run the rapids of going up the yield curve to make batteries. Many of these guys never get past the build the building phase.
Yeah. And that takes, at least twice as long, if not more than that, than it does in China, in the U.S., right? Europe's even worse.
It'll be interesting to see, as the Chinese companies are working with partners in the U.S. Some of them have very strong ideas of how you go scale a battery factory based on their experience in China.
Yeah,
It'll be
it
interesting to see what
requires
happens.
greenfields.
Yeah, it'll be
yeah.
interesting to see what happens when they run into building a building in
Yeah.
the U.S. And
Yeah.
I'm personally aware of a number of
Yeah.
these
Well, I mean,
joint
I've talked
ventures that
to
are like really in trouble.
Yeah, I
and
talked
they're
to several
at the
of them.
foundation of
Yeah.
the groundworks phase.
Yeah, yeah, but I think they understand it now. Like, so you look at their timelines, and they have like their China timeline. Like, yeah, we can have from groundbreaking to first cells off the line, maybe 9 months.
Yeah.
You're like, oh my god. In the U.S., like you can maybe like from site selection to groundbreaking is maybe 9 months or something like that, right? So it's a different order. But
There's a whole other set of problems that
construction
somebody
is
needs to go fix.
problematic, to say the least.
Yeah.
So, you had those things. And then I think the other advantage that you've got in China, certainly, but probably also in Korea, is just the capital markets and the capital structure around these projects are set up in a way where it's easier to attract capital for projects that have much longer return horizons, that are potentially lower hurdle rates than what we have to deal with here. And probably substantially more flexible when you hit problems, provided that you are still employing the number of people you've said you're going to employ. I mean, in China specifically, I think a lot of this capital is coming from like banks that are very like provincially or local government aligned. Those governments are strongly incentivized to see employment rates out of those factories. So that's the biggest thing that they care about. And when you care mostly that you keep your workers employed in the line running, you care about that more than how much like profit you're actually making. That's going to drive prices down, which is, the whole world has benefited from that in a lot of ways, and the prices have fallen, but it's also hollowing out manufacturing infrastructure everywhere else in the world as well, which is a problem that we've got to grip with. But I think, there's a lot of structural problems. One of them is that our capital markets here have grown up in a way to like squeeze every penny out of, they're super advanced, right? They're great at generating high profitability, but high profitability is not necessarily, if you look at the range of economic outcomes, beneficial outcomes that you might want to have for an economy, it's not the only thing that you care about. One of the things you might care about is like, do you have a manufacturing sector? Do you have supply chains that are resilient, right? And those things cost profit. And so I think just the aggregate effect of that has made it so that there's such a structural advantage now. And of course, if you look at CATL's profit margins now, right, or BYD or the leaders there, they make good, very healthy margins, right? But they didn't for a long, long time. And if you look at like, putting that much capital at risk in the West for that long to get to the profit margins they have, I don't think that any investor would be interested in that sort of
on its own.
Yeah.
What do you think about the current policy environment in the West and maybe in the U.S. in particular, since that's the one that we're probably the most familiar with?
I guess it's an interesting question. The policy environment that is on paper, like what is actually in law and on paper right now, is incredibly good. It's the best, the best industrial policy, more than I think we could have hoped for as an industry. That said, it's almost the worst case, or it's almost like the worst of both worlds in that it's an expensive policy. You need to put a lot of capital behind this to make it work. Or maybe not. There's probably other ways that are less capital intensive, but this one is fairly capital intensive.
And by this one, you mean
the IRA plus tariffs.
Subsidies plus
so
tariffs.
I don't think like the Biden administration did some great stuff for batteries and domestic manufacturing. You've got to give credit to the first Trump administration. They were the first ones to get tough economically on China and put tariffs in place. That was the first sort of brick in the foundation of doing this. And so these two things together, and a general sort of pushback on Chinese firms just taking just a part of the process, the minimum part that they have to do into a domestic market to make that to sort of skirt any regulation or rules. I think that's the preference of any firm. Any logical firm would make that decision, right? Because it's cheaper for you to do this in home country where you have most of your resources. But there's skepticism about that, especially with respect to Chinese firms in the U.S. I think probably Korean firms, probably a similar thing has happened. There's less skepticism, probably just because of the geopolitical risks. But with respect to China, who are the real competitors, there's not a law, but there's a lot of like political pushback to make that happen. And so these convergence of factors sort of set up a situation that is similar in ways to what to the industrial policy that China has had for a very long time, providing strong incentives for multinational companies if they want access to Chinese large, robust domestic market or domestic supply chain. They need to do a partnership in a way that helps local firms also learn how to do it and seeds industry. And I think we've either through intention or accident, we've set up a similar dynamic here where right now, Chinese firms especially have an incentive to partner with U.S. firms like a Peak to help them set up domestic manufacturing in a de-risked way and start to catch back up to the advantage that they've gained. Now that's what it's on paper today. Now it's expensive because it's a combination of political pressure, subsidy from the IRA, tariffs which make everything cost more. And if you stop it right there, it's great. Let's just use this, and the problem will start to correct. Problem is, capital investors who have to look at this environment and say, okay, this makes the case for investing in a factory economically attractive. They're looking at returns. Like even with this in place, it takes 5 years for you to pay off those billion-dollar investments you have to make. They're looking at it and saying, well, I don't know if the IRA is going to be here in 2 months. I don't know what the tariff structure might be. I don't know if we're going to suddenly let Chinese companies build their factories here and then drive all my projects. So I'm going to sit on the sidelines and not doing anything, right? And that's what you see happening, right? So the issue is great on paper. The policy environment looks super good. The uncertainty is basically just undermining it 100% right now. So that uncertainty has to go away before, in almost like it matters a lot less what is on the other side of that uncertainty, just that we get there. Mm-hmm. Of course, you could have a policy that just wipes the industry out, but I don't actually think anybody, Republican or Democrat, wants that.
I'm bullish on the policy side actually, because I think you're right. I think Trump 1.0 administration set the groundwork, understanding the competition between China, what was kind of happening from a policy perspective there, which was impacting our own energy security here. A Biden administration, obviously a huge push to go plant the seeds to develop a domestic industry with the IRA in particular. Arguable whether some of the large scale direct grant capital investments through the BIL
of those.
Actually picking is the government really capable of picking the right winners and losers there? Arguably, maybe not. Maybe that's a separate topic down the road for a podcast. But certainly the IRA, and particularly on the demand side with the ITC and the tax credits that have incentivized massive deployment of energy projects across the board, but certainly renewables and storage, seems like a highly effective policy and has put us in a position where the industry, I think here domestically, is poised to actually grow up and become competitive on the world scale. And then, in our discussions with the incoming Trump administration, certainly on the policy side, feels like the goal is right. The understanding of most aspects of the energy world is probably not that far off from what what the Biden administration was looking at. Certainly in storage, that appears to be the case, and an understanding of the dynamics of taking U.S. tax dollars and basically funneling them to foreign companies. That might not be the best policy from a security perspective, and then putting more controls in place to have those benefits actually create a domestic set of infrastructure and companies. So maybe it's by accident we ended up there, but it kind of follows the planned approach that we saw happen and was so effective overseas, not just in China, but let's call it policy in general in Asia around strategic strategic industries.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I just want to address, I know, like you said, maybe for a follow-up podcast, but I think it goes back to the patient capital thing. I think the BIL and before that DOE, LPO, those things were sort of an attempt to start to level that playing field.
Right.
I think on paper, they are the right thing. In
Right.
practice, what seems like happens there too much is selection criteria. You can argue whether or not DOE's picking the right projects. I'm not going to go there. Obviously, I have a horse in that, or had a horse in that race. But like it's, I think more importantly is if you're going to do that, to do it well, you need to be able to make. You have to pick. You're going to pick a winner, right? If you're going to do this well, you're going to pick something and you're going to make it win. You have enough capital. As long as you don't make a stupid choice, you're going to make it win, right? Maybe you could make it win more if you made a better choice, but really, at this point, like it's about committing. So that's one problem. But you're going to have to be with it through the hard times, and there were going to be. You could even make the best choice in the world, the best team, the best technology. It's still going to struggle. So you're going to have to. And in a democracy where you have sort of the dynamic that we have, especially today in the U.S., and I think increasingly Europe seeing this too, where you have this like high degree of polarization. And everybody's looking at every little thing and trying to say, okay, I'm going to attack that as some reason you shouldn't be in power anymore.
And it switches back and forth every 4 years.
Yeah. And
That
even
gives
if you like
any
believe
particular project,
Yeah.
2, maybe 3 years to like basically go from zero to success.
Exactly. You need stability, right, to do that. So I think that maybe there's an inherent problem in our current political dynamic that make things like grants just not.
Yeah.
But maybe you could. I don't know if from an industrial policy, maybe that's like. I'm interested in this topic in general. Like, can Western democracies actually have an effective answer to industrial policy that we see in places that are more centralized control, more insulated from sort of public opinion?
Right. So let's bring it back kind of to the Northvolt question, kind of summarize. So what I heard you say in the kind of the discussion that we had, if we think about the factors that made it difficult and ultimately maybe got us to this point at Northvolt. So crawl, walk, run, and the total scope.
Yeah.
Don't waste all your money on building a greenfield factory, which goes along with the crawl, walk, run, right? Because if the scope is so big that you have to build your own factory, then you gotta do that, right?
To borrow from the VC space, like minimum viable product, right? That's something everybody understands.
Exactly.
So like minimum viable business plan.
And then design the product that could actually be made by the equipment that you have access to.
Heavy focus on DFM.
And if you have that product spec'd, we didn't really talk about this in detail, but it feels like this is a key part of the story as well. If you're unable to build that product at acceptable economic yields, you need to have the flexibility with your contracts with customers in order to make changes in order to improve yield. Otherwise, you just by definition will go out of business.
Yeah.
And that's a problem, particularly around the automotive space, where attention to those quality details, of course, really matters in all markets, but particularly in that one. And their whole downstream manufacturing process depends on those things being stable.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's very little flexibility to change that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's not just customers. Customers are a big part of it. It's also your owners, your investors. You need to have stakeholders on board who are willing to ride that out with you and accept changes to the plan, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you can't have a myopic focus on this was our plan. We have to execute our plan. We're not going to change the plan. Because on paper, you can still be on the plan, but you're not actually on it anymore.
And then a final one perhaps is kind of maturity in the policy environment, rules of the road being stable.
Yeah.
Which that's one that today jury's still out.
Well, I'd say that's holding us back right now. I guess if I could make any ask to anybody in any position of power, it's like I think I'm totally with you that like part of the reason we started Peak Energy is because we really want the U.S. We want to prove that we can do this, like that the West can do this and can be successful. I know we can, right? But we need stability. We need to understand what the rules of the world are going to be around this industry before we're able to go play the game. And so please just write the rules down. Write them down faster.
Yeah.
Write them down as fast as you can. I don't care what they are. I'll play by any rules you put down, but I need to know what they are.
Awesome. Couple of quick questions. We touched on this up front. What is it about Tesla engineers? What was it about that experience during that particular moment in time? I mean, I think if I, we'll see what history has to say about Elon Musk, but perhaps his greatest legacy might not be his companies, Tesla and SpaceX, et cetera. It might end up being the diaspora of people that have emerged from those companies in such a uniquely trained state, and how effective they have become. And, I think about how the visions for those companies attracted the best and the brightest engineers in the world, really. Mm-hmm. And it became acceptable and cool to go work on real world full stack hardware problems, not mm-hmm. just building the latest app. And mm-hmm. then it became cool for investors, not just cool, but lucrative mm-hmm. for investors to invest in these things. Mm-hmm. And then these people went through trial by fire and emerged. I don't know how many there are, hundreds to thousands of new companies that were then founded by ex-Tesla people to go make a difference in all sorts of different parts of the economy. I mean, you're an example of this yourself personally. Peak Energy has, I don't know, 50 ex-Tesla engineers maybe. What was it about that experience that created these these engineers who really think differently, I think, than others?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about, Tesla it's highly mission driven, or was highly mission driven. I'm not going to talk about it now. I'm going to talk about my experience when I was there. I think the world has changed a lot since then, and probably Tesla has as well. But you joined that place. At least I joined, and I think many of the engineers who I know, or other, not just engineers, like all walks of life, but like I think Tesla is just one thing that was different is like it is heavily engineering focused, right? Like in terms of administration overhead and all this stuff, those functions existed. They have to exist in any company, but they were lean and they were extremely good. Like they were almost starved for resources across everything. But that starvation made them extremely good. And also on all sides, like even in engineering teams, even though most of the company was engineers, which is an important distinction, like heavy focus on the tech and engineering and the product was a key foundational thing about Tesla. You didn't have a lot of like people with nebulous job descriptions and stuff. Everybody who was there, it was hard to be at Tesla and sort of coast at that point. If you didn't have a very specific thing you were doing, you weren't going to survive for very long in that place. So just by virtue of the fact that it was the cohort of people there were so focused on technology and engineering and understood it, even if you weren't in those functions, you were expected to understand it. And expected to know that you're supporting that work. And so that was part of it. And then if you joined there, you're joining generally people who joined because they were mission driven. They believed in what Tesla was doing deeply. And they joined because they were like, just like, why do you join the SEALs? I think Elon talked about this in the early days. Like, this is like the Navy SEALs of doing this. You almost like, it's going to be really hard. It doesn't rationally make a ton of sense what you're about to put yourself through, but you just kind of want to see, can I do it? Can I keep up with the best of the best? And so you sort of had this weeding out. And then once you got inside, it wasn't bullshit. Like you were working on incredibly hard problems. You were changing the world. Like literally that's what we were doing. I mean, Tesla is one of the largest companies in the world now. And when I joined, we were 2,000 people. It was still questionable whether we were going to make it. And like that's a super short amount of time for that to happen. It changed, and so I think that, and then it's tough for me to because I haven't talked to Elon since I left Tesla. I joined Tesla because of Elon. he started SpaceX. I really wanted to go work at SpaceX. I thought if I worked for Tesla for a little while, I could go to SpaceX. And then once I got into Tesla, I fell in love with it and never wanted to leave. But
So that's great. I didn't really realize that you went to Tesla as a backup option because you really wanted to go to SpaceX.
Yeah, and I would have told you. And I'll tell you now. Like Elon was a hero of mine back then. I think since I left Tesla, we haven't had any engagement. I would say politically, we probably don't see eye to eye. It doesn't seem like it. And I thought that the reason he was at Tesla and the reason he was doing things at SpaceX was because he truly believed that we had to electrify everything and get the world on sustainable practices. At Tesla, I thought that SpaceX was about like continuing the advancement of human species, both in terms of like giving us something to strive for that's outside of just the next great app or something like that, but also making us so anyway, all of that stuff.
So that's the mission aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
And then there's maybe the mission attracts, or the SEAL Team 6 piece attracts a self-selected group of people who are.
But Elon
would be successful.
Foundational to this because he is like, I've seen a lot of people who've never. It's similar to the Northvolt thing. You have a lot of people who sit on the sidelines, have never seen inside any of these companies, and they say this is why this is happening. Or there's like a lot of people in Reddit threads or whatever that like Elon is not an engineer. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just great at. Elon is smart. He's fucking smart. That guy is brilliant.
Yeah.
He's a brilliant person.
Yeah.
And he's a polymath. He knows a lot about everything, and he is in the details. And and again, I can't speak for what he's like now, but he was there. He was there all the time. He worked really, really hard, and you would tell him about something, he would know details that were surprising in almost every interaction I had with him. That he knew that much about the product.
Yep.
And you couldn't change the product without having him be part of it. He was deep in engineering reviews, so I think just one, he made a lot of very good calls. He made some bad ones. But he made a lot of very good calls on the business and on the product directly. And just the fact that he was that involved pushed that culture down through the entire company.
I went through an experience at Innovix where, one of our key investors, and he probably ended up saving the company multiple times, was highly involved, was a guy named TJ Rogers, who, iconic Silicon Valley semiconductor guy, has a pretty strong reputation as I think he was on the cover of Business Week, the bad boy of Silicon Valley, right? Mm-hmm. Very tough guy to work with. And he pushed the company and the people in ways that if he hadn't pushed that hard, we wouldn't have gotten to that level of outcome. Mm-hmm. I don't have the counterexample of somebody who is also let's call it a softer, gentler type of leader to see whether they could, from a positive side, get that level of performance out of it or not.
Yeah.
What's your thought on that?
I don't think that there's a single answer to that question. I think it depends on the thing you're trying to do. And I also think that there is some selection bias in this, that the most visible examples that we have are people that are the most polarizing.
I think you're right about that too.
And so you're going to notice them more because they are more noticeable.
It's a more interesting news story.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't think I'm an asshole, and I think Peak is already doing pretty amazing things.
Yeah. My observation of the team here, and there's a strong component of the Tesla culture here. Not that we have I think, particularly negative culture at all. Actually, I think it's super positive. But I feel like the culture really drives people to do their best and go above and beyond. But it's coming from a place of growth and positivity as opposed to, I'm scared I'm going to be fired, right?
Yeah, and I don't like
self-driven, self-motivated people.
Yeah. But I don't think actually people didn't work at Tesla harder because they were afraid they were going to be fired. I think it was like almost they managed to do it despite that sometimes.
I feel that way too in my experience.
And I don't it's really interesting. My first meeting with Elon, was he cut it. It was supposed to be an hour meeting, cut it in 10 minutes. Said this meeting's a fucking waste of time, and walked out. I thought I was going to get fired. So like my interactions, like I experienced Elon when he was the most harsh, but when I worked for him, it always felt like he cared so deeply about the mission and the product that you almost were like, okay, yeah, I understand why. Which maybe it's like, Stockholm syndrome or something.
Well,
but like
you did
I
live in
was
Stockholm
okay
for
with
a long time.
I did, yeah. But it felt okay because like you were like, I understand why he's doing this. Like somebody has to look out for the product and for the mission, and it's bigger than me if I'm a casualty of it. Now, that's not my leadership style, but I wouldn't, I don't know how he is now. Again, I don't know if I wouldn't have classified him as an asshole. I think probably substantially less empathetic than, it might be my preference for somebody who I would want to have, a ton of interactions with might always be, but I don't know how he was with his family. Right. And at that time he was already a billionaire and all that stuff. So I don't want to make excuses for Elon. I would say he was I don't think without Elon, Tesla would have ever done what it did. He had to be he was a critical part of that chemistry. I am deeply concerned now because we need Elon. We need more Elons. We need that is, I go to China. I feel like all of China is Tesla energy. Like it's Tesla speed, the entire country, right?
Yeah.
Tesla is one of the few places I've been outside that I feel that same thing. And fundamentally, we needed Tesla. Tesla was a force for absolute good in the world. Without them, I think we'd be 10 years behind where we are on the transition. And we're already 10 years, probably 20 years too late.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Why did you, after your experiences at Tesla and Northvolt, why did you decide to start a company in this space?
I'll give you an anecdote here. So I didn't mention this about why Northvolt failed, by the way. One thing we should mention is we tried to scale our first factories during COVID, which did not help entirely with most of our suppliers coming from China. So we should throw that in there. But just give that context here because when we were bringing up Northvolt Labs, I was literally living there. We were working, there were many days where I was in the dry room for like at least 15 hours and, at the office, like sleeping there, sleeping 4 hours a night. When I wasn't sleeping, I was working. And like, I only left the dry room to go to the bathroom, eat, and for an occasional meeting that we couldn't take inside or on the phone. And so I'm doing this. It's brutal, doing it for months. And I would remember in the morning, every morning I get up and I gave myself 15 minutes to eat breakfast and listen to a podcast. It was the Economist podcast. And there was a period of time during this where like crypto was going insane. And I think I heard, but like, it was like a 2-week period where I first heard about a company. I can't remember which one, but some meme coin company or something. It was like, oh, this is funny. And then 2 weeks later, it has like $1 billion valuation. And I'm sleeping on the floor of Northvolt Labs. I'm like, oh my God, like I should have done a crypto company. There's so much easier ways to make money. So I like resolved, I'm never going to do a hardware company again. I'm going to go do crypto, or probably should have done an AI, something with insane valuations. And I left Northvolt, and we could talk about it on a follow-up about like why we started Peak. But I left it partially because it was time for me to go for many reasons. One of the reasons I left was because I saw this opportunity on sodium, and I just knew at Northvolt, like we had so many other challenges and priorities, we weren't going to go as hard at that opportunity as we could, and it was frustrating.
Sodium-ion batteries.
This was sodium-ion
for grid scale storage.
Exactly. And so I had this idea in my head when I left, but I also had this other conflicting idea that I should start a crypto company because it's way easier than this. Like batteries are the hardest thing you can do. And then I go and started thinking about what company do I want to build, and working with Eclipse, that's where I met you. And we kicked around a bunch of other ideas, almost every idea I could think of that wasn't battery related. But like, I just didn't feel like I could live with myself if I didn't do this thing. It seemed like such a great opportunity. It seemed like something the world needed, that was a potential for the West to show that we could do this thing. So ultimately, like I bit the bullet and, glutton for punishment. We're doing it again.
Well, we laugh about this. I mean, you mentioned we met each other at Eclipse Ventures. Actually, on my first day, transitioning from Enovix, my previous company in batteries, to being an investor. And I think I told you on that first day, I'm never starting another company, definitely not in batteries. No one could ever make money in grid storage, and no technology could ever be better than lithium-ion batteries. So that's how we started our relationship together.
Yeah, I think one thing we're both very comfortable with is admitting that we were wrong in the past, right? It was like,
it only took me 4 months for you to convince me I was wrong on all 4 factors.
There you go. There you go. Well, we convinced each other. The opportunity was too good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. There's a lot to unpack there, I think, around what happened at Northvolt, and hopefully people get a sense that multiple factors, a complex situation, and the story may not be over. What's your thought? Do you think Northvolt can make it through bankruptcy and maybe reduce its scope a little, focus on the core mission, and emerge again?
They've already reduced the scope a lot. I worry that, and there's some structural, we didn't talk about everything, like building the factory up in northern Sweden in Skellefteå made it really hard to recruit great talent. Even though like energy prices were low, land prices were low, the talent thing became a controlling problem.
Yep.
So like, I think there are still some structural issues that are going to be very hard for Northvolt to get through. I really hope that they pull through this thing. There are some incredible people there who have, blood, sweat, and tears for years. I did that for 5. They've been doing it for 8 now. It's an incredible asset and group of folks with great experience. I worry that the ownership, like the ownership structure currently in the company, and then the sources of capital that are needed to sort of get it out of the position it's in, neither of those things, like that's the risk I see. Other than the foundational issues, like being the factory way up, that's probably solvable. But like, I don't know if you're going to find, but I hope they do. I hope they do, because
we'll see.
If you had a company, if you had a company that could make batteries in Europe right now, think about how valuable that would be.
Yeah.
Like it'd
There is no CATL of America.
Anywhere
or
outside
of Europe.
Yet
In today's world, how could that possibly be the case forever?
Yeah. We'll see. Well, I think it's up to us as a society. We have to decide if we're willing to really commit to it.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right, Landon. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.